Hello and welcome to this week's video on colour. This week we're going to look at colour relationships. What goes with what? So we have been playing a little bit with some of that idea of colour relationships. That being primarily the complementary pair, which it's probably all there in the name. When we've been looking at Van Gogh, so talking about putting complementary colours together to get them to vibrate, to enhance one another, to create movement. So that's what putting colours together is all about. It's about creating interest. It's part of creating the narrative in our paintings or in our work in general. And it's not just about painting and drawing and anything like that. I mean, some of these concepts I also use in other things that I do, like knitting. So that, when I'm doing some fair old knitting, which involves the combining of colours together, that you've got to think about what works with what. So some of these things that we're going to look at are suitable for other aspects of our lives as well. The charts that I have done here are all using a colour wheel, and then I have just coloured certain segments, and the examples that you're going to see here are using gouache. So let's start with the complementary pairs. This first colour wheel that you can see here using yellow and violet is a basic complementary pair. So it's demonstrating that any colour and its opposite on the colour wheel, directly opposite, will be complementary, or a basic complementary pair. So in this second one here, you can see then yellow-green and red-violet are then opposite one another again and are a complementary pair. So both of these are examples of complementary pairs. The next range of colours that you're looking at here is what's called an analogous grouping. So that's when we're dealing with a wedge of the colour wheel. Either from, in this example here, you can see three colours, so working from a yellow-green through to blue-green, or you can then sometimes push that analogous grouping out to about to 5. So here I could have included yellow through to blue, and that also would be talked about as an analogous grouping. So it's any time that you're using a colour and its near neighbours, you would talk about that as an analogous scheme. In this example, I have used a yellow and a blue to mix all of these greens, Prussian blue and a cadmium yellow, for instance. And I've mixed those varying greens from just those two colours. In this next example, which we would still talk about as an analogous grouping, I have used different yellows, different blues, and I've also added white into the middle one to create different versions. But we would still talk about this as being an analogous grouping, because I'm not going out into yellow, I'm not going out into blue, there's no oranges, violets, etc. that's been added. We're still dealing with a yellow-green there, this time mixed with yellow ochre and ultramarine blue, a green with white added to it there in the centre, which is a cad yellow and ultramarine blue, and then the bottom one there is is a cadmium yellow and Prussian blue. You'll notice there though that there are links from one to the other, so that in two of the colours ultramarine blue is used, and in two of the other colours yellow is used. And that's an important thing to note when you do then start to use other colours other than just maybe two colours for a grouping like this, is look for ways to link them, or that there are colours that link sections of the different colours together, so that they still have harmony. In this next example, this is a split complementary. So we looked at before a direct complementary where we're dealing with one colour and its direct opposite. In the case of a split complementary, it's where we use the two colours either side of the complementary. So here we've got an orange made with yellow ochre and cad red, and its split complementary to it would be blue-green and red-violet, and the blue-green made from yellow ochre and ultramarine blue, and the blue-violet with ultramarine blue and cad red. And there again is an example of using just a single yellow, a single blue and a single red to create this. So that means there's these beautiful links when you have that, that you keep it to those three primary colours like that. In this next example, this is an example of the same complementary scheme. Starting with the same orange mixed with yellow ochre and cad red, but this time working with different blues and different yellows to create the blue-green and the red-violet. In the case of the red-violet too, I have added some of the yellow ochre and cad red to the blue-violet that I mixed there using ultramarine blue and cad red, and added white to it. So it's a slightly neutralised, it's slightly desaturated version of what it could have been. The other example that you see there using lemon yellow and Prussian blue is that all the other colours that we're mixing there, yellow ochre, cad red, they're either warm or hot, and here we've then contrasting that with a cooler colour. So when we then put them together, there is that slight little bit more interest in terms of that there's some more contrasts going on there other than purely the contrast of hue. In this example, we're looking at a triadic colour scheme. So this is where we're using three colours that are equally spaced around the colour wheel. The classic triadic colour scheme, of course, is our primary colours, yellow, red and blue. But in this case, we're dealing with a triadic that is yellow-orange, red-violet and blue-green again. In this example, I have just used three primaries, cadmium yellow, cad red and ultramarine blue. In this example, which is representing that same triadic as we've just seen, but in this case, I'm adding in earth colours. So the yellow-orange is made with cadmium yellow and cad red, and I have added its complementary in. So that would be a cool cool blue-violet, and mix that together and add that into that cad yellow, cad red mix, which is the one that we saw up here above. So I've desaturated that cadmium, or that yellow-red, that yellow-orange, I'm sorry, and then also then kept with it a lemon yellow Prussian blue, cooled, and then a burnt sienna, an ultramarine blue over here with the red violet, plus some white in it too. So we're introducing some earth pigments. So again, this demonstrates how to be creating a more subtle relationship between these colours, something that's maybe a little bit more harmonious, is when we go beyond just using three colours and then start to look at contrasts of, as I said before, saturation, tone and temperature. In this example, this is what we call a tetrad, in terms of that you're either using a rectangle or the concept of a rectangle there in the center of the color wheel, or in another example that we'll see in a moment, the use of a square in the center. So it's 4 points touching the color wheel. This is also known as a double split complementary, which is, if you hear me say that, which is what I'm more likely to say, is this is the kind of color scheme that I'm thinking of. In this case, I'm using the same yellow, the same red and the same blue to mix all of these 4 colors. So cad yellow, cad red, ultramarine blue again. And we can see that essentially they're a grouping of 2 complementary colors, or 2 complementary pairs. In this example, I have maintained the cad yellow and ultramarine blue to mix the yellow green, but in this case varied it up by adding burnt siennas in, yellow ochres, and changing the violets and the red orange that you can see. So again, those same ideas as what we've been thinking about before, is that we can alter those other colours and they still will have a sense of harmony because of their positions on the colour wheel. Here we have another tetrad, and this is where we're using the square in the centre of the colour wheel. So again, it is essentially 2 complementary pairs placed together. In this example again, I'm using cadmium yellow, cadmium red and ultramarine blue. In this example, it is the same tetrad, the same combination of colours, in that it's yellow, red orange, violet and blue green, but in this case I'm working and changing the tones, the temperatures and the saturation of those colours around the colour wheel, and so they still maintain a harmony because it's the use of a tetrad, but yet at the same time there's some lovely interactions and a muting, and it tells a different story to the one that you saw before. So where does this lead us? What can we take and use as practical information from what I've just shown you? A lot of these would very much suit themselves, as I mentioned before, to if I was knitting or thinking about changing the cushions on the couch here at home, would be that I could start to think about going from a scheme like this, using those very bright colours, to something more muted and working with some of these more earthy type versions and using them in the same way. But I'm approaching these videos in terms of art and coming up with ways for you to be able to use it then in your own painting or drawing or printmaking or whatever you're doing. So I want to show you maybe a system or a way of working. It's only one way of working, it's not the be all and end all, but it is something to practice, and it's that idea that if you practice any of these ways of using colour, you're going to become better at recognising it in nature and then being able to use it perhaps in your own work and building up your confidence in placing colours together. So in this example that I'm showing you here, I'm thinking about painting a red apple. And so I look at the red apple, and it's my starting point in terms of my colour wheel. So in the colour wheel, I mix the red that I want to use for the apple and paint that down. So immediately we're going to use for the background then its complementary colour. So in this case, with this red, which is, I've used cadmium red, so it's a warm red, we want to do everything that we can do to its complement, being green, to make it more complementary to that red. So it's not just then in hue, it's saturation tone and temperature. So what I have done is that I got out then my coolest blue and coolest yellow, that being Prussian blue and lemon yellow, and mixed a green from those. I've added white to lighten it, so that then changes the tone of the colour. And I have then also added some of the cadmium red into that green, and that begins to then neutralise it and make it go grey. And in this case, it almost looks blue, but I can assure you it is quite green. We then introduce that other pair. Now, these are another term that I use to describe these colours are bridges. They bridge the gap, or they bridge the eye and the comfortableness of looking at this subject matter from the red to the background colour being green. And so this is where we're introducing then the yellow orange and a blue violet. And often the answers are there. Those colours will be there in somewhere in what you're looking at in terms of the subject matter. So in terms of a red apple, is that often it's not maybe entirely red. Maybe it's more like a pink lady or something like that has those blushes of yellow-orange in them. Even if it is something more like a red delicious, they then have sometimes blushes of the blue violet in them. So you could be using either of those ideas on either of those colours to then add another colour there into the apple. And here you can see that I've used that yellow orange. I have lightened it by adding white and painted that down in as that blush of colour on the apple. Then I've introduced its complement using cadmium red, which is the colour of the apple, and using then Prussian blue to mix my blue violet, and painted that in as the shadow and the cast shadow of the apple. By using a colour from the background and using a colour from the main motive or the object itself, this then starts to help link that background and the main motive together as well visually. In this next example, which is along those same lines, starting with the red apple as the main motive, I've introduced then a second object, this time being a green pear. Now immediately you'd say, well, there's a green pear in there, so there's green and red, there's your complementary pair. But if we look at that green pear even a little bit closer, we can start to see that it's actually probably more over there in the yellow green segment rather than the pure green segment. So it gives us the opportunity to introduce a split complementary into our colour scheme. So in this case, I've introduced the pear as the yellow-green, as the split complementary of the red apple, and it means that then I can change the colour of the background. So the background then becomes a blue-green. In this case too, I've changed the tone, so we've kept the tone of the background quite dark, and so it tells a different story to that previous still life. And I have also added a little bit of cad red into that as well, so it is a desaturated Prussian blue and lemon yellow blue green. And as before, using the yellow orange and the blue violet in the same way. So for this week's exercise, what I'd like you to do is I would actually like you to start and work through a series of charts like I have done here, starting with a complementary, working through an analogous, and I would start them with a, like I have here, with a controlled one, and then go off with then a whole lot of different colours, and thinking about, as I said, those adding in desaturated colours with saturated colours, lighter colours with darker colours, warms with cools, to see if you can create greater harmonies. Work your way through them right up to those tetrads, and then maybe have a go of finding an object like an apple and just keep it really simple. Don't try and find anything really complicated. Keep it to something simple like that and create the little still life or the little picture like that. Keep them simple. You can see I haven't painted them. They're not absolutely accurate. They're not, I'm not going for perfection. It's purely just to see how these colours are working with one another and how you can possibly use them in your own work. As always, good luck, and I look forward to seeing what you come up with.